Michael, we are extremely grateful that you have joined us tonight for this timely and important conversation. I'm also pleased to introduce my longtime friend and tonight's moderator, Janis Kearney. Janis is an author, book publisher, and writing instructor. Following a 9-year career in Arkansas state government, Janis served briefly as managing editor for civil rights legend Daisy Bates' historic Arkansas State Press newspaper before purchasing and becoming publisher of the newspaper in 1988 upon Bates' retirement. Janis served in the Clinton administration for the full 8 years and was appointed by President Clinton as the first White House presidential diarist. In 2001, she was selected as a fellow at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. And in 2003, Janis and her husband Bob Nash, another former White House colleague, founded Writing Our World Publishing, a small independent publishing company. Janis has written or co-written 8 books, including her first, the critically acclaimed Cotton Field of Dreams, a memoir. In 2014, Janis founded the Celebrate Maya Project. Its mission is to promote the life and legacy of Dr. Maya Angelou throughout Arkansas communities and schools. And the Clinton Presidential Center is proud to partner on this incredible program. Janis, I'm so grateful to you for moderating the conversation. So now I'm going to hand it over to you to begin.
Hi, Michael. This is Janis. It's so wonderful to be here with you. I'm looking forward to talking to you about your book, The Skin You Live In. And I know we don't have enough time, but there are a million questions I have for you. But let me just start by saying thank you to Stephanie and the Clinton Presidential Center for asking me to be a part of this evening. And I am going to start asking you this, Michael. Can you tell us what it was that motivated you to write The Skin You Live In?
What motivated me is an incident much like many that happen with parents all across this country and have happened for generation after generation. My 5-year-old son at recess had gone into the playground and was a victim of name calling, racial disparagements. And it was the first time he had ever dealt with such a situation. And when he came home, he brought that situation to me. He really didn't understand the name that he was called because it was the first time he had ever heard it. But he knew that it did not make him feel good. And when people have often asked me what was the name he was called, I always tell them it wasn't on his birth certificate. Okay? So there I am with a 5-year-old. As a parent, I'm hurt. I've gone through this same situation myself. And all of us parents who have had childhood pains do not want them revisited on our children, but that's unavoidable. Right. And I'm trying to think about how to have a conversation with him, not just about name calling or bullying, but about racism. And that's a very difficult conversation to have between adults. So trying to find the words and the articulation to give that to a 5-year-old that not only will allow him to grasp what I'm trying to tell him, but at the same time mitigate the feelings that he's having, eliminate the trauma that he's just gone through, was just too much for me in that moment. So I often say that this is a moment when parents come to terms with their parental omnipotence. It's a fallacy. We do not know everything, even though we want our children to have some security in thinking that we do. So I told my son, I said, give me a day or so. I want to read a few children's books. And when I find one that I think is a good one, I'll bring it back to you, I'll read it, and then we'll have a conversation about it. And what I thought was only going to be a 1 or 2 day research project turned out into a 2-week research project. And I read 347 books. I didn't find a single book that I thought I wanted to read my son. None of them had the merit of message that I was looking for. Far too many of them, for example, were books that worked on this paradigm where they took an inanimate object or inanimate objects and they made them human-like, and had a conversation about what their differences were. The conversation usually was an argument. until some event precipitated them thinking that they were all beautiful and they were all equal. And I always say to the parents that there are a lot of books out there that are like that, but for your child, it's just talking Kool-Aid pictures. It's just talking toothpaste tubes. It's just talking toothbrushes. That's all they are. Conceptually, at that young age, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, they're not getting that. Their understanding is far more literal than the concept being projected in stories like that. The other paradigm is one in which an individual who's very different is introduced into a community of people and is immediately alienated and ostracized because of the difference that they have, until that difference proves to be of some utility for that community. And then they are welcomed in. And I did not want my son, whose existence is already being politicized because of the color of his skin, I didn't want my son thinking that his value as a human being and his welcoming or fellowship in a community was predicated upon his usefulness to people who would otherwise ostracize him. I don't think that's a message that any parent or any educator should be teaching a child. The classic story to give that example, if people out there are wondering, is Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Rudolph was completely ostracized until his red nose could save Christmas. And I don't think that's a message that we should give anyone. The other thing that I saw repeatedly over and over again is the bigger view, the larger message, is that so many of these books push tolerance as a moral virtue. They push tolerance as a conduct that we should try to embrace and apply to our lives. And I happen to think that tolerance is actually part of the problem, because tolerance simply means to endure something. Mm-hmm. We walk down the street, and sometimes and occasionally we smell foul odors coming out of the sewer. We will endure it for the distance it takes us and the time it takes us to walk past it. But we don't want that scent following us all day long, right? And when somebody shakes your hand and it's too tight, you would tolerate it because you know it's going to be a brief moment of time. But nobody wants that discomfort in their hand all day long. And so I never saw, growing up, I had this realization when I was 15 years old when I was trying to study etymology of words. I never saw tolerance as something that we should be advocating as a moral virtue. When you look at hate, when you look at the isms of the world, pathologically as a disease of character, for example, to me, tolerance is only a placebo because it doesn't do anything to lessen the symptoms, mm-hmm. to get rid of the pain once that disease has been infected and inflicted, and it does nothing to provide a cure for it. So I knew that of the three paradigms that I just got through speaking about, that was nothing I wanted to give my son, so I had to write it, and that's how I ended up coming to be.
Amazing, wonderful. Well, let me follow up on that because your book is so timeless, especially with what's going on today. So you published your book in 2005. How would you say we've done as a country? Have you seen progress over these last 15 years or so?
That's a great question. It's a very difficult one to answer. If I had to do so, I would say, let's think of astrophysics for a moment, because there's a question and debate whether or not our universe is contracting or expanding. And there are many astrophysicists out there who say it's happening at the same time. It's expanding and contracting at the same time. So when I look at progression and regression on the issue of discrimination and racism, I see that event happening at the same time, that we are moving forward. Mm-hmm. We're also moving backward. Now, that may question whether or not we are actually advancing at all. I think it's more an issue that the polarity of moving backward and moving forward is stretching the center. And that's what we're seeing as a rupture of our society right now, because of that polarity is coming about in very disparate ways. And so I look at it that way because since 2005, we had our first African-American president. Since 2005, we are poised to probably have our first African-American female vice president. So when you look at that as progression, it's fantastic. We look at individuals who've made inroads in media, in corporate America, sport, obviously, and politics. So we have had some advancement, but as we've had an advancement forward, we've had the historical legacy of racism as a reaction to pull us back, and that's what's rupturing this country right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you wrote this amazing award-winning book for your child to address a problem that your child had. But did you think at all that this book might resonate with adults as well, as it does? From what I've read, there are as many adults that actually love your book as children. So tell me whether you thought about that when you were
Yeah,
writing it.
I'm glad you asked that question. I did. I consciously thought about that when I was writing the book, because as I was researching to write a book, wrote the book for my son, one of the things that I understood immediately in terms of how I was going to direct the message towards my son was that children are imprinted by racism and sexism between age 2 and 3. Whether a parent or an adult in that child's life is purposely doing that or not, intentionally doing that or not, the messaging that they're getting from everyone else, the messaging they're getting from their cartoons, from the TV, from the dolls that are sold at store, are giving them that message that this is greater than and this is less than. And so with that in mind, I also researched and came across the fact that 80% or more of all children's books that are bought by women.
Mm-hmm.
It's often been said that mothers are the first teachers of the child. And so when I put those two facts together, it occurred to me that if I was to write anything, I had to write something that was also going to be an audit for an adult reader. They had to have some moment of reflection while they were reading this to a child. The challenge in that was, how do you create that moment of reflection without creating emotional triggers?
Mm-hmm.
Because this subject immediately is emotionalized by people. And that's one of the main reasons why, if not the main reason, we never get any progress in overcoming it. So I had to think about word choice. That was my immediate decision, that it was going to be lyrical. It was going to be a poem, because it would be very easy to read. It would be sort of a hypnotic feel to it. It'd be easy to commit to memory for the child, but it would also keep a sort of playful sensibility about it. When I was thinking about writing it and thinking about one day having it illustrated, for example, there are a lot of children's books out there where the illustrations are very close to what real children look like. Sometimes they use photography. I didn't want to go that route at all, because I thought, again, those would be emotional triggers. I wanted to have some kind of illustrative representation of the book that was abstract in some way, so that people could put themselves into the character without looking at a character and judging the character. And I think David Lee Sisko, the illustrator of the book, did an incredible job with that. I was very happy to get him. But I definitely thought ahead of time that I was writing a children's book for adults.
Great. I love it. I love it. So let's go a little dark and talk about today, when the global pandemic is disproportionately affecting Black and Brown people and children and families. How do you think your book addresses the issues that we are seeing play out right in front of us around race and discrimination?
I think that it can be used for children and families and the schools as a resource to address the overall mentality that leads to the disparate consequences that we see right now. There's disparity in education, there's disparity in housing, there's disparity in healthcare, as we see right now. But all of those fall under a larger mindset, and that larger mindset is the ism that has long plagued this country. And also part of that is the tolerance that is supposed to address that ism. My book delivers a message of acceptance. Now, when I say that, people think that tolerance and acceptance are perhaps synonymous terms. They are not. They mean totally different things. Tolerance as a practice in society is civil segregation. That's what it amounts to. It says that because of law, because in order to have it as a policy and practice, it has to be supported by law. It says because there's a law, I'm going to be civil in how I am around you in public, but I still don't want you around me when I go home. That's the policy of civil segregation that's in place. And that's what tolerance supports. So it doesn't do anything to dismantle the infrastructure of bigotry or prejudice or discrimination. Acceptance does. I said that tolerance earlier was a placebo. I see acceptance as being more a cure. Acceptance requires three things. First thing is recognition. When we walk down the street, we don't even look at each other. We look through each other, we look past each other. We have to actually see one another with our eyes and recognize the presence of another individual. By doing that, we can acknowledge their existence. If I smile or wave or nod, I'm actually acknowledging your presence. If I simply look at you and offer no facial expression at all, I'm acknowledging your presence. But by offering some kind of civil gesture, to go back to that word, a smile or nod, I'm doing the third thing that is required of acceptance. And that is, I'm affirming your value as a human being in front of me right now. And that recognition, acknowledgement, affirmation is totally different than what tolerance advocates. And so if we give our children that instruction of acceptance, of recognizing, acknowledging, and affirming the value of other people, I think it will do much to produce a generation of individuals who will look at the disparity that we are looking at right now and realize that it exists because we do not recognize, acknowledge, and affirm people. So I do think it can be a resource for that.
Great, great, I love it. So in today's current climate, it's not just the pandemic, but it's also the racial struggle that we are going through today. How do we stay optimistic? How do you stay optimistic and feel encouraged about the future? Tell me, how do you do it?
That is very difficult. As a child, I had no real awareness of what was going around me, even though I was born into the civil rights movement, the civil rights era. As I got older, I began to have more awareness. The conflict developed inside of me. The older I get, for a period of time, I was getting more hopeful. I think the hip hop generation did much to bridge social gaps that existed. And so I saw our youth, because all societies and cultures change through youth movements. So I saw our youth coming together in a way that I hadn't seen before. As of late, I've been greatly discouraged by what I see happening in this country, what has taken place over the last 12 years, not just the last 4 years. Because what we see in the last 4 years actually had its origins when Barack Obama became president of the United States. That's when this entire backlash began. And it's only gotten more animus to it since then. I maintain hope because of how I define hope. So I'd like to offer that definition and share it with everyone. I define hope as an emotional alignment to possibility. Because where you see no possibility, you are hopeless. And to me, hopelessness is the single most detrimental state of mind anyone can have. And so as long as I see in our society, I see in the streets protests, and I see for the first time, because I remember the riots and protests of 1968. I lived through that. I see for the first time, Black protesters are outnumbered by non-Black protesters. I've never seen that before in my entire life. That demonstrates to me a possibility that there is an awakening, there is an awareness, there's a moment of introspection and reflection going on. And again, we see this happening in our youth. I see mothers in Portland taken to the streets. I see mothers in Chicago taken to the streets. So I see something that makes me still align myself to the possibility. The other thing that gives me hope is that if you look at history and you look at societies that have had great revolutionary changes, they've always had, prior to those changes, tremendous tumult. Because systems can't simply mutate. They have to be broken down, dismantled, gotten rid of, and then something else is brought in. And so I look at this period of time right now, even though it's greatly distressing, tremendous amount of anxiety, a lot of vitriol, I look at it as a precursor to a moment when this country might actually have a revolutionary change. And to the extent that I say change, let me just correct myself on this point, because change is too small a word. If I move a chair from one end of the room to the other, I change its position in the room, but it's still a chair, right? Every single night, the moon changes its position in the sky and also changes how it looks, but it's still the moon. So we use this word change and we call for change, but we need to recognize that what has to happen in America needs something bigger than that. And what we really need, and this is a word I want people to put in their minds so they can put into their conduct, is we need transformation. When a caterpillar cocoons and emerges as a butterfly. It becomes something, a being, that it can never, ever again be what it was once before. A butterfly can never, ever again become a caterpillar. It's undergone an alteration so profound that that transformation is the change that we see. In this country, we must have words that lead to thoughts, that lead to conduct, that lead to policy and legislation, that lead to rapport between one another, that creates an America that is so profoundly altered, we can never again be what we were once before. So I find hope in that.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So I know you can't go around and talk to parents and older people who have relationships with children, but I would love to know how could mothers, grandmothers, guardians use your book to teach children about race?
The first thing I would say is it's a happy book. So they don't have to have any emotional anxiety about presenting the book to their child. It's a wonderfully illustrated book, so the imagery will keep them captivated. It's very lyrical, so it's very compatible with their memory. So these are all points that an adult can feel comfortable about bringing to a child. The other thing I would say is there are two parts of the book that I really want to call attention to. First part is, how do we begin to give a different model to our children about how to describe one another with respect to our skin? The terms black and white are political terms. You go anywhere in the world and speak about black people and white people, and you know what dynamic you're talking about. You're talking about racial hierarchies the moment you mention those words. And as long as we continue to politicize our existence, we will continue to have a politicization of race that creates the systemic racism we know of as our reality in this country. So I wanted to address that issue and give parents and educators another model to offer children, so that when they say what color skin that is, or why is that person that way and I'm this way, they can do so. And so I chose to use food because that's a universal frame of reference for everyone. And I chose to use delicious food for people to refer to the color of food as being like the color of skin tones. So that's something that can be immediately adopted. The other part of the book is what I call the dismantling of discrimination. When I knew that I wanted to present this book to my son as a solution for the experience that he had, I knew that I had to be very direct about it. Again, my research backed that up as well, that the understanding of children in that age group is very literal, it's not conceptual. So I knew I had to talk to my son about what skin was and what skin was not. And that there's a section in the book that really deals with that. It's not this skin, it's not that kind of skin. And I think that it allows parents and educators to have a very comprehensive perspective of what we lay on to the meaning of skin with their children in words that they can actually understand. So I think that with those two things particularly, the book in totality, that it can be a very helpful tool for individuals who want to address this issue with their children.
And some of the conversations I've heard so many, especially fathers, talk about how hard these conversations are, but also mothers to talk about race and some of the things that children will experience. Tell me what age you think these conversations should begin, and why is it so important in our culture to have these conversations?
I definitely think that they should begin, I would answer two ways. One is when your child first brings you to your attention that they have an awareness of difference. Immediately then you should begin to have that conversation, because the first thing you should be able to tell them is that that difference does not mean disdain is required to view it, okay? The second way I would answer it is, as I've always understood from psychology, that the first 7 years of our life provide the moral foundation for the rest of our lives, those formative years. So we need to be addressing this issue with our children well before they reach the age 7, because by the time they're age 7, whatever that we put into the concrete of their moral foundation is going to be with them for the rest of their lives. So I would answer those. My mother told me right before I became a father that the moment your child brings to you a question or a statement that indicates to you that they have an awareness of something, it's incumbent upon you as a parent to not dismiss it, to not belittle it, or to not put it off, but to find the words and the way to address it for their understanding in that moment. And I hope that this book will be able to provide that for other parents, because that's the reason why I wrote it in the first place, so that I would be able to do that with my own child.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Now we have a question from the audience, and this question is, what advice can you give to aspiring authors? Bet you haven't gotten that question ever before.
The first thing I would say is, whatever level of frustration you have, you need to magnify 100-fold. And it's not because of the writing process. It's because of the publishing process. So that's the first thing I would say is get ready. You're going to deal with criticisms. You're going to deal with the editorial feedback of your work. You're going to deal with rejections. The Skin You Live In was rejected 147 times before it got published. Okay, so you're going to deal with that. But understand that the one thing you cannot, should not, must not do as you deal with it is personalize it. Because tastes vary. And so you go regionally and taste the one thing. You go to publishers in New York, they're one thing. You go to publishers down south, they're another thing. You go to publishers in Canada and the UK, they're another thing. You just need to find the one editor out there who realizes what you wrote and has merit to it. So don't personalize, because if you do, that negativity that comes from personalizing will end up in your work. So that's the one thing I would say, that's the mindset they have going into the publishing business. As a writer, per se, I would say think of yourself as a painter, okay? If you only have one color to paint with, how interesting a painting are you going to be able to produce? If you have 100, how interesting of a painting are you going to be able to produce? The pigments and the painting for the author are words. Expand your vocabulary. Read and learn and understand what words really mean. Understand them to the point that you can define them without looking them up in the dictionary. You should be able to have your own definition for the words that you use. In addition to understanding and expanding your vocabulary, understand your audience, because vocabulary range varies depending on your audience. I wrote a book about discrimination and racism and acceptance. I could write that book for adults, and the vocabulary range is going to be dramatically different than what The Skin You Live In has. A children's picture book, you can't rarely exceed 600, 700, 500 words. I had to get that message distilled down into under 500 words. Whereas I'm writing that subject for adults, I can write 3 volumes of it with respect to adults. So you need to understand who you're writing to. I used to teach writing workshops, and I would ask people when they showed me their manuscripts they were so proud of. I would say, who do you want to read your book? And they said, I want everybody to read my book. And I would say to them, I said, now you got a problem. Because the Bible has been touted as the greatest story ever told, and not everybody reads that. So you really need to understand who you're writing to. If you can envision who you're writing to, then you're going to be a writer, because you're writing to an audience that already exists. So those 2 things more than anything I would say, and just don't give up. Believe in your voice as a writer. Do not sacrifice that. When you get into an editorial process with editors and publishers, that editorial process should be, how do you sharpen and hone in the story or the narrative? It should not be about changing who you are and how your voice represents who you are, because that's valid. I've seen too many publishers do this with women because they want to process a woman's voice for patriarchal ears. I've seen too many publishers do this with African-American authors because they want to process their narrative for white sensibilities. And so even if you have to turn down a book contract, if you're fortunate enough to get one, because you realize that the editorial process that it is about to undergo is going to change that, because it should only make the story better. It should not alter you or your voice. Then understand that that is what you need to preserve. That's the third thing that I would tell people as they're pursuing becoming authors and writers. It is a challenge, but it is very worthwhile if you go through it. It's very worthwhile.
Amazing, amazing advice. That's wonderful. Okay, drum roll, because I'm going to ask you the question that every presenter gets at the end, and it is the bridge builders question. Each speaker is invited to offer a call to action, a charge to each person in attendance to learn more or do something that adds to the bridge, that together we are building to the future. What is your call to action to our audience tonight, Michael?
I would say I have two that are equally important, and I'll try to rush through them because I know we're coming to a close here. The first one is based upon an adage I heard my entire life, an African-American maxim I heard my entire life, and that is each one, reach one, each one, teach one. And I would say use that with respect to how we register the vote and how we turn out to vote. Many people don't vote in this country because they're embarrassed the fact that they never have. And they think that the process to vote is very daunting. They think the process for registration is very daunting. And so for those of us who have registered and for those of us who have actually voted, we need to pal up. We need to buddy up with someone who hasn't. Because they're intimidated by it. They're embarrassed by it. They would do it if they could get over that intimidation and that embarrassment. We need to buddy up. Each one of us needs to reach out to someone. Each one of us needs to teach someone how to do it and bring them into it so that we can increase the amount of people who are participating in this process. The second thing that I would say is an extension from that. I have looked historically at incumbency rates. They tend to be 93 to 97%, which means there's a 3 to 7% window of opportunity anybody new is going to get into the system. We have to change that. The marginalized people in this country, the disenfranchised people in this country are never going to have representation in our legislative bodies until we change that incumbency rate. And there's only one way to do it. We have to have term limits. We have to be able to purge people from office and end the professional politician system that we have here that is funded by an oligarchy that is running this country right now. In order to restore the republic that we have as our democracy, we need to be able to purge that system. We need to create a larger doorway for more people to enter, particularly as this country is demographically shifting and changing, so that we can finally have the concerns of the disenfranchised and the marginalized historically enter into that process and be evaluated. So each one reach one, each one teach one, and go out there and try to get some term limits on a ballot somewhere. We need to have those.
Wonderful. You know what? I know what your next book should be. It should be a YA, young adult, on public service.
How about that?
The power to vote and change.
You've given me an idea.
I enjoyed it so much. Thank you a lot. And I am now going to turn it over to Miss Stephanie.
Wow. Well, thank you both, Michael. Really appreciate you sharing your hopeful and transformational book with all of our viewers this evening. And of course, Janis, thank you as always for your friendship and for being the moderator for tonight's very important conversation. I want to remind our viewers who have joined us tonight that you can purchase Michael's book from the Clinton Museum store, and I highly recommend it. So you can go to clintonmuseumstore.org, and in the right-hand search bar at the top of the page, type in The Skin You Live In, and you can purchase that book directly from the museum store. Again, thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight for this really timely and beautiful conversation. And please stay tuned. We will have another Bridge Builders program later this month to be announced soon after the holiday. Good night.